At first, nobody would know anything had changed, because sunlight takes about 8 minutes to reach our planet. For those few minutes, life would continue normally, unaware that the center of our solar system had already disappeared. Then the sky would begin to change, not with explosions, but with a silence no human had ever experienced. Daylight would vanish, shadows would disappear, and people everywhere would look up, realizing something impossible had happened. Solar panels would stop producing power, plants would stop receiving light, and Earth's natural rhythm would break almost instantly. But the real danger would not be darkness alone. It would be the slow collapse of everything powered by the sun. Heat would begin escaping into space, and without sunlight, the planet would slowly start cooling from the surface down. People might survive the first day, but they would quickly realize this was not a blackout. It was the end of daylight. And once the sun is gone, survival becomes a race against cold, hunger, darkness, and time itself. For about 8 minutes, Earth would still receive the last sunlight that had already left the sun before it vanished. During that short window, the world would look almost normal, while the truth was already moving toward us at the speed of light. Satellites would notice something strange first, as solar radiation, light levels, and space weather readings suddenly began falling apart. Scientists would see impossible data, but before anyone could explain it, the final sunlight would reach the planet. Then, across the day side of Earth, sunlight would fade, as if someone had slowly turned off the entire sky. Shadows would soften, colors would drain away, and the familiar blue sky would begin collapsing into a deep, unnatural darkness. Birds would fall silent, animals would become confused, and humans would stare upward, unable to understand what they were seeing. Within minutes, the event would be visible everywhere facing the sun, but communication would struggle to explain the impossible. People on the night side would not see the change immediately, but they would soon notice the world had stopped making sense. Those 8 minutes would be the last normal moments Earth ever had before darkness became the new reality. After the final sunlight fades, Earth would not freeze instantly, but the planet would begin losing heat every single second. Power grids would face impossible demand as millions try to heat buildings without enough energy to keep them alive. The cold would not arrive like a single disaster. It would creep into walls, streets, machines, and human bodies. At first, people would fight the darkness, but soon they would understand the real enemy was temperature itself. And as Earth kept radiating heat into space, survival would become a race to stay warm before everything froze. Without sunlight, photosynthesis would stop almost immediately, cutting off the process that feeds nearly every living system on Earth. The atmosphere and oceans would hold warmth for a while, delaying the worst effects, but only for a limited time. Within days, average surface temperatures would begin falling sharply, especially in places far from oceans or underground heat sources. Cities would feel the change first, through failing heating systems, frozen pipes, and homes that slowly become impossible to keep warm. Without sunlight, the ground would lose stored warmth, and every night would become colder than the one before it. Snow and ice would spread into regions that had never prepared for temperatures this extreme or darkness this permanent. Food reserves could keep humans alive temporarily, but no civilization can survive forever on stored supplies alone. Herbivores would struggle first, then predators, then humans, as each layer of the food chain began to collapse. The loss of sunlight would not just darken the planet, it would slowly remove the engine of life itself. And once the food chain begins breaking, survival becomes less about comfort and more about how long supplies can last. Without the sun, Earth's weather would slowly lose the engine that drives winds, clouds, rain, storms, and ocean movement. Plants would not die all at once, but they would stop making the energy needed to grow, repair, and survive. Grasslands, forests, crops, and ocean plankton would all begin weakening, removing the foundation beneath the global food chain. The most dangerous collapse would begin in the oceans, where tiny plankton support much of the life beneath the waves. As plankton decline, fish populations would shrink, and marine ecosystems would start breaking apart from the bottom upward. On land, crops would fail, because farming depends not just on soil and water, but on light from the sun. Weather is powered by uneven heating, and once sunlight disappears, that temperature engine begins shutting down across the planet. At first, storms would still exist, fed by leftover heat stored in oceans, land, and the lower atmosphere. But over time, the atmosphere would calm in a terrifying way, as the forces that create weather slowly disappear. Rainfall would change dramatically because evaporation depends on sunlight pulling water upward from oceans, lakes, rivers, and soil. Clouds would become less active, storms weaker, and the water cycle would begin breaking apart from the top down. Weather is powered by uneven heating, and once sunlight disappears, that temperature engine begins shutting down across the planet. At first, storms would still exist, fed by leftover heat stored in oceans, land, and the lower atmosphere. But over time, the atmosphere would calm in a terrifying way, as the forces that create weather slowly disappear. Rainfall would change dramatically because evaporation depends on sunlight pulling water upward from oceans, lakes, rivers, and soil. Clouds would become less active, storms weaker, and the water cycle would begin breaking apart from the top down. Farms would fail first, not because the soil disappeared, but because crops cannot grow without light, warmth, and stable seasons. Greenhouses might survive for a while using artificial light, but only where power, heat, and supplies could still be maintained. Food prices would become meaningless in many places because money cannot buy what no longer exists in warehouses or fields. Governments would begin rationing food, but rationing only works when there is enough supply left to distribute. Meat and dairy production would collapse as animal feed disappeared, leaving livestock systems unable to continue for long. Fishing would also decline as marine ecosystems weakened, and frozen ports would make seafood harder to harvest or transport. Cities would depend on stored food, but every stored meal would become part of a shrinking clock. Hunger would not arrive everywhere at once, but it would spread outward as transport, storage, and production failed together. Without the sun, feeding humanity becomes less like agriculture and more like surviving inside a sealed, dying machine. As Earth keeps cooling, the oceans would not freeze instantly because water stores enormous amounts of heat beneath the surface. Ocean currents would slow as temperature differences faded, weakening one of the systems that moves heat around the world. Regions once shaped by seasons would lose their rhythm because there would be no sunlight to divide warmth, growth, and time. Earth would not become peaceful, it would become still. And that stillness would mean the climate system was dying. When the sun disappears, weather does not simply get worse. It slowly stops being the world we recognize. As plants weaken and temperatures fall, the global food system would enter a countdown no government could easily stop. Fishing would also decline as marine ecosystems weakened, and frozen ports would make seafood harder to harvest or transport. Cities would depend on stored food, but every stored meal would become part of a shrinking clock. Hunger would not arrive everywhere at once, but it would spread outward as transport, storage, and production failed together. Without the sun, feeding humanity becomes less like agriculture and more like surviving inside a sealed, dying machine. As Earth keeps cooling, the oceans would not freeze instantly because water stores enormous amounts of heat beneath the surface. The surface would freeze first, creating a thick layer of ice that slowly spreads across seas, lakes, and coastlines. Beneath that frozen shell, liquid water could remain for a long time, protected by pressure and trapped internal heat. This means some ocean life might survive longer than life on land, especially near deep-sea hydrothermal vents. These vents do not need sunlight because they support ecosystems powered by chemicals rising from Earth's interior. Far below the ice, life would continue in small pockets, hidden from a frozen world collapsing above it. Underground shelters could protect people from extreme cold, violent surface conditions and the total absence of natural daylight. The most valuable places would be near geothermal heat, where warmth from Earth itself could replace sunlight temporarily. Nuclear power could also keep some communities alive, but only if fuel, maintenance, and technical systems remained stable. Food would have to be grown under artificial lights, inside sealed farms that recycle air, water, and nutrients constantly. Every breath, every watt of power, and every drop of water would become part of a fragile survival calculation. Life underground would not feel like civilization. It would feel like living inside a machine that could never stop working. If one system failed, heat, oxygen, food, or water could disappear fast enough to threaten everyone inside. The strongest survivors would not be those with weapons, but those with energy, engineering, food systems, and discipline. Without the sun, humanity would survive only where it could build a small artificial world beneath the dead one. After enough time without sunlight, Earth's surface would become almost unrecognizable, a frozen world under permanent darkness and stars. Cities would still stand, but they would become ice-covered monuments to a civilization that once lived above the ground. Roads, airports, farms, and coastlines would disappear beneath snow and ice, erasing the patterns of human movement. The atmosphere would grow colder and thinner in places, turning the surface into one of the harshest environments imaginable. Most surface life would vanish, leaving only traces of forests, oceans, cities, and ecosystems locked beneath frozen silence. Above ground, survival would be nearly impossible for long because cold, darkness, and isolation would dominate everything. Below ground, small human settlements might continue, but every surviving community would depend on fragile artificial systems. A broken generator, failed reactor, or contaminated water supply could end an entire shelter faster than any outside threat. Humanity would no longer rule the planet. It would survive in hidden pockets beneath a world that no longer needed us. Earth would still exist, but the living world we knew would become a memory preserved under ice and darkness. So could humans survive without the sun? The answer is yes, but only a small number, and only at an impossible cost. Shh! But we would lose the world that made human life feel human. No blue sky. We might survive the loss of sun lino seasons, no sunrise, no natural rhythm, only the constant fight to keep darkness outside. Maybe the real question is not whether humans could survive, but what survival would mean without the sun. Because without the sun, Earth would still exist, but the world we call home would be gone forever. Because without the sun, Earth would still exist, but the world we call home would be gone forever.